Welcome to Family Basics 101. I'm Dr. Bruce McClure, and as we begin our 5-part series this week entitled Crises Management, we will look at 5 components of crises. The first day today, we will talk about just a simple definition of what is a crisis. Next, we will look at the myths about crises. Third, we will look at the source of crises. And fourth, we will look at the stages of a crisis. And then finally, we will discuss how do you help people navigate the major crises of their lives. So let's begin by defining a crisis. According to Dr. H. Norman Wright, in order to assist families, individuals, or institutions, we must first make sure that we define a crisis correctly. So what Dr. H. Norman Wright argues is if a proper navigation through a crisis is to take place, then those who are helping with the crises, as well as an individual who is engaged in the crises, must have a proper working definition that is clear in the mind of both the helper and the individual who is in need of help. If a clear understanding of what is or what is not a crisis, helpers might find themselves trying to move people away from not a crisis, but rather an internal struggle that is simply a part of daily life rather than a world-shaking emotional challenge. So in essence, the summary is this. If there's not a clear understanding of a crisis, then every event in an individual's life will necessitate a response from a helper as if it is a crisis, when in fact it might be just a regular routine situation that for the most part life presents. A crisis, by definition, is an event that overwhelms or immobilizes a person. A crisis, by definition, is an event in which a person has failed to properly resolve a problem within themselves that is triggered by some external force outside themselves. A crisis sometimes hits without warning, and yet sometimes it can be anticipated. A crisis must be a threat to a person's security. So when we look at the components of a crisis, by definition, it overwhelms and it immobilizes. By definition, it's not handled correctly, resolution is not handled correctly, then it will cause the person to become stuck wherever they find themselves in that moment of whatever that crisis is. And many times crises hit without warning. Many times crises are anticipated. And in order for it to really become a crisis or to be a crisis, the security of a person, their life must be threatened, their well-being must be threatened. And if that is not the criteria by which a crisis is defined, then many times we are mistakenly labeling what is really a loss as a crisis. Do not mistake one for the other. A loss is anything that impacts one's ideas